Good morning. Good to see everyone this morning. We are beginning a new book. We finished the book of Joshua last week, and really in the Hebrew Bible, Joshua and Judges, I believe, come together as one unit, and for good reason. You'll see that in the very opening verses of this, and it'll appear again a time or two as we go through. Now, you should, there were a number of handouts handed out, and if they're not enough, maybe one of the elders will go make a copy for us. Judges, interesting book. The basic theme of the book is that Israel's failure as a theocracy to keep the covenant, even under the leadership of men chosen of God, to deliver them from the oppression of the pagan world. I want you to think about it. A theocracy is where God rules. Theos, God. Ocracy is basically means rule. Like we have a democracy, theoretically at least. It's a democratic republic. But at any rate, that's what we're talking about here. God is their ruler. God is their king. And I'm not sure that they ever really lived as if they understood that. And we're going to see that over and over again in this book. Kyle and Delitzsch, who are particularly good with the Old Testament, describe judges as those who procure justice or right for the people of Israel, not only by delivering them out of the power of their foes, but also by administering the laws and rights of the Lord. In other words, a judge would not only help them defeat their enemies, but he also would help them when they had problems with each other. Or she, if you're talking about Deborah, did that as well. They judged in matters of the law, serving as the head of the government under the direction of God. And there's the key. The judges understand who the leader is, and they will go with him. When the people asked for a king, God said they had not rejected Samuel, but they'd rejected God. That's in 1 Samuel 8:19. And so what does that mean? Well, if you think about it, that means that in the book of Judges, as we've already mentioned, God ruled. That God was in charge of Israel during that period of time. So how long does the book of Judges cover? Well, about 350 years are covered in that. That's from the death of Joshua to the rise of and really the rejection of Samuel. So really the period of Judges extends on into the opening chapters of the book of 1 Samuel. And you got a judge in the form of Samuel, who of course also is a priest. He's serving there in the tabernacle along with Eli. So that's a rough understanding of that. Kyle did say they soon grew weary of the task of fighting against the Canaanites and destroying them. They contented themselves with making them merely tributary. In fact, they even began to form friendships with them and worship their gods. And there comes the problem. They worship their gods. And that's going to lead to a conflict between the children of Israel and God Almighty. And that's part of what we see throughout the book. As punishment for this, the Lord gave them over to their enemies so that they were repeatedly oppressed and deeply humiliated by the Canaanites and the nations that were living around about Canaan. But whenever they repented and turned again in their distress to the Lord their God, He raised up helpers and deliverers for them in the persons of the judges. Now, all that's a bunch of words. You see the chart? Everybody see the chart that comes next? There's a chart, I think. Didn't I keep that chart there, or did I? No? Not on your material? It's not there. Okay. Sorry about that. I should have brought the whiteboard out then. I want you to think about the way the Judges works, because it's a cycle and it goes over and over and over again. They just keep doing it. So you start out with the people served God. And when they served God, well, everything was good. God took care of them. But then a new generation comes up, or a new group of people who no longer recognize God as their leader. And when that happens, they forget what He's done for them, and they go off chasing after other gods. So they do evil in the sight of the Lord, and that's a repeated theme in the book of Judges, that evil that they did. And we're going to talk a little more about that as we go along. So when they did evil, what did the Lord do? Well, He had an easy answer for that. Okay, let me turn you over to somebody else, and they will discipline you. And so God actually uses the Canaanites and the Midianites and the Edomites to discipline His people. And I want you to remember that, because that's not something that stops with Judges, is it? When you think about the northern tribes, weren't they disciplined by Assyria? When you think about the southern tribes, weren't they disciplined by Babylon? See, so this is something God continues to do really throughout Old Testament history. Does it over and over again. Well, then, when the oppression begins to intensify, what do the people do? Well, they start to complain. They start to groan. They start to cry out to God for help. And when they finally really cry out to God for help, then the Lord raises up a judge, and that judge delivers them. So that's the cycle. And if you were to write that cycle down and observe it as you go through the book, you're going to see that happening over and over and over again. So we go from one judge to another with that same problem being repeated. Judges is not so much a chronological history or a historical account, but a topical presentation of selected events. Nevertheless, during 3 out of every 4 years that the book chronicles, the people enjoyed overall peace and prosperity. Now, that's Holcroft that is indicating that. And if you were to write down how many years of peace they had, and then write down the years of oppression, really most of the time they had peace. But they had peace when they were yielding to God, or He tolerated them for a period of time. And that gives me cause to pause just a little bit. Because God will tolerate evil, but He won't do it long. So how long will He tolerate what's going on in our country? Well, that's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I know historically it won't be forever. I'll put it that way. Eventually, He will deal with it. Where does the title Judges come from? Well, it really comes from the Septuagint. Whenever you see that, if I've got that in your notes, that LXX, that's the Septuagint. It was a translation done by some 72 men. They took the Hebrew copy of the Old Testament and they turned it into Greek, because most people read Greek, just like we have English translations. We don't have Hebrew, we don't have Greek, we've got an English translation. Well, that's much the same thing that happened with this book. Briefly look with me at Judges chapter 18, verse 1. Judges 18:1. And then don't go anywhere. 18:1. In those days there was no king in Israel. And in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in, for until that day their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. We could say that differently, couldn't we? They'd not really gone out and conquered the people. That's why it didn't fall to them. It's not that God couldn't give it to them. It's that they were unwilling to work for it. But the key expression there is, in those days there was no king in Israel. Look at chapter 19, verse 1. And it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel. Now, really there was a king, that was God, but they didn't acknowledge Him. They didn't follow God. And so there was no king in the sense that there was no human being to whom they yielded or the one who they followed. The author of the book of Judges is unknown. Some people have said maybe Samuel. I guess that's a good guess, but it is just that. It's a guess. So who wrote it? I don't know. Inspired of God? Yes. And how do I know that? We'll see that in just a minute. It'll be very clear. The purpose of Judges, according to Gleason Archer in his introductory text, the Old Testament, is to glorify the grace of the God of Israel. And if you think about it over and over again, we're going to see God glorified. Think just briefly about Gideon and the 300 men. Who gets the glory for that? Well, not the 300 men. God does. Because it's evident that God was the one who delivered them. So Judges will do that again and again as we go through it. All the author's material, Archer says, has been arranged according to a unitary plan exhibiting a single dominant idea. Israel's welfare depends upon her spiritual relationship to Jehovah. If Israel is going to do well, it's going to be because they're relating well to God. If they don't do well, it's because they're not relating well to God. And so that's Archer's observation. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, go with me for a moment. You may want to mark these passages if you do that kind of thing in your Bible. Let's start with Judges chapter 2, and we're going to start with verse 11. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Okay, they did evil. Look at chapter 3, verse 7. And again, what do we find? So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Look at verse 12. And the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. Look at chapter 4, verse 1. When Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. In chapter 6, verse 1, notice what the writer says. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Look at chapter 10, verse 6. Once more, what do we see him writing? Well, it's the same thing. Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, the Asherahs, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the people of Ammon, the gods of the Philistines, and they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. By the way, how many idols do you see listed in that verse? There's 7. 7 different idols. Look back. Baals, Asherahs, gods of Syria, gods of Sidon, gods of Moab, gods of Ammon, gods of the Philistines. 7 different gods that they were, little g gods. And if you read the book, let's say the book of Isaiah, he's not the only one, but it's fascinating to watch Isaiah describe the ridiculous nature of this. A fellow cuts down a tree. He uses part of it to warm himself by a fire, to cook his food on, and then he carves a god out of the rest of it and bows down and worships it. That's ridiculous. And Isaiah makes it clear that's ridiculous. You cut down the tree, you made a fire out of it, you cooked your meal over it, you made the god. So who's really the god in that case? Well, if you want to worship anybody, I guess you worship the man. Because he's the one that did all the work. Now, that wouldn't be appropriate, but still, that's the idea. Now, look at one other theme that you'll see again and again in the book of Judges. When the judge completes his task, then we've got this. Look at chapter 3, verse 11. So the land had rest for 40 years. Look at verse 30, same chapter. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. And by the way, 40 and 80 is how much? Not 120. We've already got 120 years of rest. I want you to remember that because we're going to see more, a little bit of that. Chapter 5, verse 31, where we find, "Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength." So the land had rest for 40 years. Now what are we up to, 160? 160 years of rest so far. Chapter 8, verse 28. One more time. Observe what the writer says. "Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more, and the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon." Now we're up to what, 200? Now we got 200 years of rest. And if the period of the judges was only 350, then we've only got 150 left, and we could do a little bit more. We'd find more than that. But those are the two key things in the book of Judges. One, they did evil. Two, when they came back to God, he gave them rest. That's over and over and over again in the book of Judges. Okay, Holcroft writes a little bit more about the judges themselves. He says, "The Israelites were one people united in commitment to God and the Mosaic law. God used the judges, but he intended the nation to be a theocracy that he ruled through the person of the high priest." See, really, the judge is just a temporary ruler put in place to deliver them. Really, the one that's supposed to be ruling is the high priest. Why? Because the high priest goes where to get his instructions? To God. He uses the Urim and the Thummim, and you get over to the case of David. And when David wants to know what God thinks, what does he do? Calls for the high priest. He says, "Bring the Urim and the Thummim with you." And then he says, "Ask God this." And he gets the answer. So how was God going to rule Israel in this time? We really planned to rule it through the high priest. The high priest would approach him through the Urim and the Thummim, and God would say what he wanted. That's the way it was supposed to be. But you know as well as I do that the book of Judges doesn't work that way. There's a word, the word translated judges most of the time in our Bibles is the word shaphat. It denotes one who imposes judicial decisions, rules, or governs, provides national leadership, and manifests eminence. Thus, a judge was the total governing authority of the nation. They didn't have any kings. And now you begin to understand a little bit better, perhaps, why Samuel was so upset when they rejected his leadership. Because he was really leading for God, and they rejected him. Now, God made it clear, well, they didn't reject you. They rejected me. And there's the critical matter. A few facts about the books of Judges, and this is what I referred to a little while ago. At least 6 other books refer to the people and the events that the book of Judges describes. For example, 1 and 2 Samuel, Psalms, Isaiah, Acts, and Hebrews. And Hebrews, if you get to chapter 11, you may remember that he says, "Time would fail me to talk about." And among the ones he talks about is who? Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. Those are all judges, aren't they? So does the writer of Hebrews believe the book of Judges is inspired? Yes. And so should we accept it as part of the canon? And I would say yes, we should accept it as part of the canon because inspired men accepted it as such. Its account of events bridged from the settlement in the land under Joshua to the establishment of the monarchy under Saul. And remember, monarchy is not what God wanted. Never did want a monarchy. That's what he got. That's what he gave the people because they wouldn't do anything else. But it's not what God wanted. The book points us to the sovereign Lord who uniquely determined the course of history on behalf of his chosen people. That's from Holcroft. Okay, I'm not sure which one. See, I didn't keep a copy of what I gave you. I trimmed it down to make it fit. So I don't know which one of these outlines you have. But here's an outline that Hamilton gives in his commentary. He says, chapter 1:1 through 3:6, it says, in those days there was no Joshua in Israel. And that's an interesting way to outline that part of the book. And then chapters 3:7 through 16:31, in those days there were judges in Israel. Of course, that's the bulk of the judges coming in those verses. And then his last way to outline the book begins 17:1 and goes to chapter 21:25, which is the end. And he says, in those days there was no king in Israel. And if you think about the way the book is outlined, remember, we looked at 18:1 and 19:1. Both those said what? No king. No king. And so he's outlined it in an interesting way, but it's pretty accurate, isn't it? That's pretty much how the book lays out. Now, what's another way to outline it? Well, another way to outline Judges is to list the judges, basically. So you begin with what might be called a prologue before the first judge appears. That's chapter 1:1 through 3:6. Then you go to Othniel, that's 3:7 to 11. Ehud, that's 3:12 to 30. Deborah, that's 4:1 to 5:31. Gideon, that's 6:1 to 8:35. Abimelech, that's 9, all of chapter 9. Then Tola and Jair, or chapter 10, 1 through 5. Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon are 12:8 through 15. Jephthah is 10:6 to 12:7. Why I got that out of order, I don't know. If it's on your thing, just reverse it. If it's not, I'll fix it on mine, maybe, if I remember. Then you got Samson, 13:1 to 16:31. And the epilogue is 17:1 to 18:31. Is the way. That's another way to outline it. Let's look briefly at Saul's sermon in Antioch of Pisidia. That's chapter 13 of the book of Acts. And in that chapter, it is interesting to notice how Paul looks back to this period and what he has to say about it. First of all, of course, he proclaims God's care for the children of Israel when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. That's where he starts with what he has to say. Then he picks up in chapter 13, verse 19, and listen to what he says there. And when he destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land to them by allotment. After that, he gave them judges for about 450 years until Samuel the prophet. Now, why the discrepancy? I've said 350 and this says 450. Well, part of the discrepancy comes from the fact that Paul is counting every moment from the end of Joshua to the end of the reign as a judge of Samuel. That's how he's counting it. The individual that I quoted earlier was counting from the first judge to the last judge. And so that cuts about 100 years off in between. That's partly how the differentiation comes there. Judges cover some events of that period with Eli and Samuel included. So if you really wanted to list all the judges, at the end, you'd put Eli and Samuel, but they're not in the book of Judges. They're in the book of 1 Samuel. And these historical books basically follow right on the heels of one another. Now, the exception, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles cover the same periods. And some of you have seen a harmony of the Gospels, and you've looked at that, which shows you kind of the way we believe Christ's life went chronologically. Well, some other people have made a harmony of 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. And so they'll kind of mix them all together to show you how it progressed chronologically. Here's a note for you and for me when we read Scripture. The Bible is not always chronological. And it doesn't have to be. See, God's trying to help us understand our relationship to Him and His relationship to other men. That's what He's really trying to help us understand. So He doesn't have to do it in chronological order. And you may discover some history books don't either. Some history books, like I've got a history book on restoration history. That's Paul and I like restoration history. I've got one that it tracks a particular thing, like the worship in song or music. It'll track all of it, the whole history. And then it'll go back and it'll track eldership or something. Track that for the whole period. So it keeps going back and goes over and over the same material. You might say, well, that's not biblical. Well, then you better figure out what you're going to do with the book of Revelation. Because it goes through history 3 times in the book of Revelation. And it is biblical to do it that way. It's just not the way we're used to doing things. We usually like, if you're going to tell your life, start with when you're born and go till you die. Of course, I don't know how you're going to write about your own death. But anyway, you're going to write your life, in some sort of order. But Judges doesn't do that. One more book is in the book of Judges, in a sense of the word. It's the book of Ruth. Ruth was in the days of the Judges. And we probably will get to Ruth, if the Lord wills, by the end of this coming up quarter, which really doesn't start till next week. It's quite interesting. The city of Bethlehem is the city, basically the meaning of the word is the city of bread. And there was no bread there. So she left and went to Moab. This is Naomi, of course. Naomi left Bethlehem, and Elimelech, her husband, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they all leave the city of bread because there's nothing to eat there, and they go to Moab. Both boys marry Moabite women. One of the women stays in the land. That's what Naomi asked them to do. Ruth refuses to do that, and she adopts the God of Israel. Now that's important. Why? Because David is from who? He's from Ruth. And she's a Moabitess. Now you might say, well, what difference does that make? Did you know Moabitess cannot enter God's presence until the 10th generation? And David's not 10th generation. So how is he able to enter God's presence? Well, the answer is she was a proselyte. She became a Jew. She said, thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. That's how that happened. She became an Israelite, not by birth, but by proselyting. That's the way it happened. Oh, I threw all that in for free. You don't have to worry about it. That's just additional information that kind of helps us understand this particular book that we're studying, the book of Judges. Okay. God ruled through the law He'd given Moses and the work of the heads of tribes and the elders of the people. That's the way it was supposed to work. You had the high priest who would consult God, and then the heads of the tribes would direct their tribes to follow whatever God wanted. God had a perfect plan. Now, brethren, I want us to carefully note that. God understands the need for organization. Somebody's got to be in charge. If we were going to build a dog house, let's say Hiram and I are going to build it. Hiram's the builder, I'm the flunky. But Hiram's going to have to tell me whether he wants me to build the side that has a door in it. Otherwise, we could have an air-conditioned house. It just 2 doors, flows straight through, right? Somebody's got to be in charge. Somebody's got to say, you You make the roof. You make the door. You make the whatever. Somebody's got to be in charge. And thus, you go to Genesis, chapters 1 and 2, or 2 and 3 specifically, and who's put in charge? Man is. Does that mean man's superior to woman? Well, no, it does not. In fact, if you read 1 Timothy chapter 2, you begin to wonder if because a woman was deceived, man wasn't even deceived. He went in with his eyes wide open and let it happen anyway. I'm not sure that's the greatest commendation that I ever read, to be honest about it. Sometimes men know what's right and don't do it. And that's actually a little bit more dangerous than not knowing what the right of it is and therefore making your mistake. But anyway, God always puts somebody in charge. He always has it organized. He never leaves his people without organization. Now, I bring that up because in the New Testament, you see an organization for the church. Didn't y'all talk about that last week in the sermon? Yeah, I think you did. Okay. So he's got an organization for the church. Who's the head? Jesus Christ. He's serving now think about this. The high priest was supposed to serve in that capacity in the Old Testament. Who's Jesus? Isn't he our high priest? He is. Look at the book of Hebrews. See if I'm not right. So God rules in Jesus' case, he's not just high priest, he's king. Because he's after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was priest and the king of the Most High God. And that's what Jesus is. So we got the head of the church is who? Jesus. That means you and I don't get to vote on it. What kind of music do you want? Let's vote. No, we got a head already. And he's already decided. We'll talk about that in the sermon today. But that's already been decided, you see. Okay, you say, well, then what organization he's got for on earth? Because you and I can talk to Jesus through prayer, but he doesn't usually make a phone call or send me a text message. So how do we decide how we're going to go and, the path we're going to follow? And the answer to that is he designated shepherds or elders. And those men are under the direction of Jesus. They're not supposed to do anything Jesus wouldn't have them do. But they're to lead the church in the path that Jesus would want them to follow. They're back to that same organization, in a sense, the word that you had in the period of Judges. Any questions up to here? I'm pouring out a lot of information quickly, and I know that. So if you have a question, ask it. Either it's really clear because nobody had a question, or it's so muddy you don't know what to ask. It's one or the other. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit further then. It seems God raised up judges when people cried out during times of suffering. That suffering was the result of their own rebellion against God, as can be seen by 3 clear warnings issued by God. So again, go back and look at the warnings, chapter 2, verse 14 of the book of Judges. Chapter 2, verse 14. What does God have to say at that spot? Well, here it is. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, so he delivered them into the hands of the plunderers who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. That's pretty clear warning there. He's using other people to issue the warning. Chapter 6. Watch it again. Now we're going to pick up at verse 7. And it came to pass when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel, who said to them, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you out from the house of bondage, and delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and gave you into their land, or gave you their land. I also said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. Pretty good warning that we're looking at there. And then chapter 10, you get one more like that. Pick up at verse 10 there. And here's what he says. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, we've sinned against you because we've both forsaken our God and served the Baals. So the Lord said, listen to his warning, did I not deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and the people of Ammon and from the Philistines, also the Sidonians and the Amalekites and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, and I delivered you from their hand. Wait a minute. How many nations did Paul say God delivered them from? In Acts 13, didn't he say 7? Is that the number he gave? Yeah, it was. All right, watch this. Look, count it with me again. And what do they say? Did I not deliver you from the Egyptians, the Amorites, the people of Ammon, the Philistines, Sidonians, the Amalekites, and the Maonites? There's 7 nations. Exactly what Paul said when he delivered that sermon. Well, go ahead. Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore I will deliver you no more. Go cry out to the gods which you have chosen. Let them deliver you in your time of distress. That's a pretty good warning, isn't it? You want to follow other gods? Fine. Follow them. But when you need something, I suggest you ask them. Now, does anybody else in biblical history basically point this thing out to the children of Israel? Well, the answer is certainly yes. But the one I'm thinking of right now is the great prophet, Elijah. And when he stands on Mount Carmel, and he's in First Kings chapter 17, I think I'm right. I may need to check that. 17, 18, right through there. When he stands before them, what does he say? He says, how long are you going to halt between two opinions? If the Lord is God, serve him. If Baal's God, serve him. And you notice the answer the people gave? Not a word. Not one word. So what does Elijah propose? Okay, let's have a contest. And boy, people like that. Going to have a contest between the God of heaven and the Baals. How'd that work out? Not very well for Baal. Why? He doesn't hear anybody. I mean, he's made with hands. Men make it themselves. He doesn't hear a word. And so they cry out all day long. Nothing happens. But God, he answers. Immediately, he answers. So that's interesting. It appears the judges did not rule all over Israel, but the tribe or the group of tribes particularly oppressed. So in other words, Samson lives in the area of the Philistines. And so who does he deliver them from? The Philistines. That's who he deals with. You'll find others deal with other individuals as we go, or groups of people as we go through the text. Joshua promised the children of Israel that faithfulness to God would yield blessings. They'd be able to drive out the rest of the enemy with only one Israelite chasing 1,000 of the enemy. And you see that, how many, for example, could Gideon's men have defeated by that rule? Well, he had 300 men, so wouldn't that be 300,000? How many were there? About 110,000. Did God live up to his promise? Yeah, I think he did pretty good. I think he got it. Just like he promised through Joshua. They'd be able to drive out the rest of the enemy with only one Israelite. We did that. He warned of the danger of forming close relationships with other nations and a failure to drive them out. We saw that 2 weeks ago. We looked at Joshua 23. That's exactly what he warned about. And in 24, what did Joshua say? Choose. Whose side you going to be on? You're going to be on God's side, or you're going to choose the gods of the people around you. You pick. But he said, as for me and my house, who's he going to serve? The Lord. And that's what they should have done. It is not what they did. When Joshua died, Israel asked God who should go up before them to fight the Canaanites. And the answer comes in 2 places. We want to look particularly, let's first look at this Numbers 27-21, because it sets the stage for what's going to happen in the book of Judges, Numbers 27, if I can get to it, and verse 21. He stand up before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel with him, all the congregation. So that's the plan. What did I say? High priest, consult with the Urim. He gets the answer from God. So go over to Judges chapter 1. Let's see if it works out that way. Judges 1. And we find, now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites, to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I've delivered the land into his hand. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion to you. I believe, and I'm not going to be able to sustain this, by a strictly biblical argument, but I believe that he sends Judah up because that's the tribe Jesus is going to come out of. That this is, in a sense, a shadow of what's coming later. Judah's going to be the leader. And if you go back to what Jacob had to say in Genesis chapter 49, when he's given everybody their blessings and their promise, he comes to Judah and he talks about the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Now, here's something interesting. Think about this. Who did the scepter first go to? Which tribe? Benjamin. Saul was from Benjamin. Did the scepter depart from Benjamin? Everybody nod your head this way. Yes, sir. It departed from Benjamin, didn't it? But then who did the scepter go to? David. What tribe is he from? Judah. Did the scepter ever leave the tribe of Judah? No. Because when Jesus comes, he's from Judah, he's a descendant of David, and the scepter stays with him. I think that all ties together. In my mind, it ties together. Now, you may not agree with me, and I really can't argue with you except just throw out these verses I've thrown out. You take a look at it, see what you think. But that's what it appears to me. Any questions on this, basically an introduction to the book of Judges? We covered 2 whole verses today. I know you're really excited. At that rate, we'll get through with this. I'm reminded about Brother J. Noel Meredith. He went to Memphis, and this church said, we would like you to come preach for us. And he said, okay. He said, here's what I want to know. Will you let me finish teaching the book of Matthew before you let me go? And they said, well, yeah, sure, book of Matthew. 17 years later, he's still in Matthew. He's got a guaranteed service, Okay. I am not going to go 2 verses a week. This week, 2 verses, yes, but we use a lot of introduction. Anybody have a question or comment? I'm going to give you, a minute and a half. So, thank you.